It's the end of what's been a year that, for better or for worse, we won't forget about anytime soon. But I promise that this video will not be all doom and gloom about 2020, the worst year ever, because what's the bet that every video recapping the year is going to start like that? Instead, I'd like to inject a little bit of positivity because overall, I found 2020 to be a halfway decent year for gaming. Sure, there were a lot of creeps getting exposed and the pandemic affected game development and production in some pretty significant ways, but even with all that, there was some genuinely good stuff released. Kentucky Route Zero and Hades finally had their full releases, and they're rad. World of Horror and Baldur's Gate 3 got released into early access, and they're pretty cool. Microsoft Flight Simulator gave everyone the world where nobody could travel. Genshin Impact seemingly got the West hooked on gacha games in a mainstream way. 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim is probably the best game of the year that nobody will play, and that's a goddamn shame. I won't sit here and tediously go through every game I played this year to give it its due. Nobody has time for that. Instead, I wanted to focus on a surprising trend I noticed when putting together my own personal Game of the Year list. You see, I kind of noticed that a lot of what I was putting on were games from franchises long considered dormant, or games that were remakes of classics in the 90s, and I'm not entirely sure why. Namely, I wanted to discuss Final Fantasy VII Remake, Street Rage 4, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. In any year, all these will be great games in their own right. Yet here's the thing. I think really highly of all three. I'm not one to rank a list of my favorite games of any given year, but if I did, they'd all be up the top of the list. Hell, at one point, Final Fantasy VII Remake was the frontrunner for my personal Game of the Year. While all three games weren't designed or marketed as a throwback to the 90s, it's hard for me not to factor nostalgia into some part of this choice. I'm getting to the point where I've realized I'm falling way too much into the nostalgia trap as I'm getting older, and I spend way too much time playing old games both on and off camera. Nobody is immune to looking back into the past and remembering the good times and stuff they experienced as they're getting on in years, but allow me to throw a spanner into this thinking. Two of those games I never really had any nostalgia for. I never played the original Final Fantasy VII as a kid, only really getting into the series as a teenager. And even then, I kinda played FF7 late, well after I played some of the other PlayStation Final Fantasy games, so it never clicked with me. Wild-type brawlers as a kid, back when they were everywhere, I didn't know anyone with a Mega Drive back when Street Rage was released, so I only got into it when Sega started releasing the games onto more frequent collections of its stuff onto, well, non-Sega platforms. The exception here was Tony Hawk, which I did play as a kid and was invested in as a series for a lot longer. If anything, Pro Skater 1 and 2 was one of the three games I was most invested in, hoping it didn't turn out awful. Sure, we hadn't got a new Street Rage game since 1994, but at least that series ended on something of a high. Tony Hawk had over 10 years of bad games, propelled by a publisher that was putting all of its eggs into the Call of Duty basket, and a developer that either never got the right budget or time, or just never understood what made that franchise great. Though that's the thing I've been constantly questioning myself on. Am I putting Street Rage 4 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 high up on my list not just because they're good games, but because I'm so starved for new games in these series and genres? In some ways, yeah, I haven't really played a skateboarding game that was as good as the Tony Hawk games in their prime, with the closest being Skate 3 in 2010, and it's a dramatically different thing still. Sure, there's things like Session or Skater XL, but I haven't really played them. However, Street Rage 4 kind of puts the kibosh on this theory. There's been plenty of great brawlers released since 1994 that have taken the concept of moving to the edge of the screen and beating up enemies into new dimensions and added depth. Way Forward resurrected Double Dragon and River City Ransom in some cool ways. Ubisoft put out a Scott Pilgrim game that I'm not overly keen on, but was pretty neat at the time. Hell, even Rockstar got in on the action with that really good Warriors game. Just because it's a new Street Rage game doesn't ignore the fact that there's been great brawlers since 1994. Ultimately, where I think these games excel and why they're placing so high on my list is because of modernization. Each of these three games take ideas and concepts from their predecessors and reinvent them to be more palatable in 2020. The most interesting aspect of all this is that all three of these games tackle this modernization in some radically different and diverse ways. Imagine if Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 was literally only just the characters, music, and mechanics of those games, but updated for 2020. Sure, they'd still be fundamentally decent games, but it'd be one of the more cynical cash-ins we've seen in such a long time. It would have continued the low-quality run of that series that came to a crashing halt in 2015 with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. By adding in the mechanics of later Tony Hawk games, newer skaters, and some brand new music, it turns what could have been a disaster into something great, and a reminder of just how awesome that series was and how great those mechanics were. The decision to portray the returning skaters as they are now is also kind of inspired and really fitting. Developer Vicarious Visions even got the feel right, something that didn't happen the last time Activision attempted to remake Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. The same goes for Streets of Rage 4. If all we got was a better looking Streets of Rage 3, look, it'd be a cool novelty, but not really all that special. What we got was a game that attempted some new things and felt like it belonged in 2020, yet still feeling fundamentally like a Streets of Rage game. The fact that the game doesn't feature an experience or leveling system when practically every game these days is an RPG is something of a bold statement, and one that understands where the series is and what it's known for. And then there's the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Easily the most drastic reimagining and modernization of the three, this remake takes the first 5 or 6 hours of the original FF7 and stretches it out to around 35 hours or so. The once low-poly slums of Midgar are way more vibrant and alive than ever before, and the rotting pizza that they're under has never looked more breathtaking. Battles are neither turn-based or completely random as they once were, but the game finds some pretty neat ways to bring in the iconic active time battle gauge to work in 2020. And yes, it's totally a modern video game because it has frequent gaps your character needs to squeeze through to hide loading screens. But by far the biggest change comes in the story. Because the game focuses on a slice of the original game, the world needed to be fleshed out and expanded upon. Same with its characters, giving Square Enix the rare chance to redefine the cast of FF7 and potentially update them to work better amongst all the other changes and additions made to the series over the last 20 years. Granted, some are better than others, but it's better than no change at all. By far the biggest example of this is the Avalanche crew. In the original game, you never learn anything about the crew save for continuing the trend of featuring a duo named Biggs and Wedge. In the remake, they're far more fleshed out, none more so than Jessie, who surprisingly gets a large part of one of the game's chapters dedicated to actually giving her a backstory, as well as exploring a part of the world that doesn't really get touched upon in the original game. These additions are what make Final Fantasy VII Remake far more fascinating to me as a means of revisiting that world in a more meaningful way than a sequel ever could. I don't know where the story is going to go in the next part of the remake, but more stuff like this would definitely convince me to keep playing. There's one other game I'd like to discuss that falls into this trend, but won't be making my Game of the Year list, despite it basically doing the thing I've praised throughout this entire video. Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time is a game that I'm not surprised is a thing, given the reaction to Activision's previous attempts at resurrecting Crash Bandicoot, and continues this trend of it being pretty darn good. It's a game that takes everything from the PlayStation era Crash games and finds a way to make it more palatable in 2020 with some cool new gimmicks, fun level design, and some great reinterpretations of otherwise forgettable characters. It was everything in the actual fourth Crash game, 2001's The Wrath of Cortex, wasn't. That was a game that almost felt afraid to break formula or try anything new with the series unless you count 60 FPS Crash as something new. So why don't I hold Crash 4 in the same company as Tony Hawk or Final Fantasy or Streets of Rage? Well, I like platformers and the old Crash games. Hell, I own 3 versions of the Insane trilogy and would easily go to bat for those games if it came down to it. It's definitely a fantastic modernization of those games while also being true to itself. It attempts plenty new while still keeping to some of its core tenets. So why is it on the list? Well, if I'm being honest, and as weird as this is going to sound, the other 3 games felt way more surprising to me. Activision have recently developed a reputation of doing right by a lot of their resurrected IPs, so I felt there was something of an expectation that Crash 4 was going to turn out just fine. It's a great game, but I wasn't surprised by it the same way I was surprised by a lot of these other revivals. The fact that Sega granted .mu Streets of Rage 4 and it turned out great is a surprise. The fact that Square Enix actually released the Final Fantasy VII Remake and it turned out as well as it did is a surprise. The fact that Activision released a new Tony Hawk game after a decade of awful ones, with this one turning out great, is a surprise. All 3 of those games turned out pretty damned well with something I wasn't at all expecting, especially since we're in peak 90s nostalgia mode. They all found ways to stand out in 2020 and be more than just, here's the old thing you like but with fancier graphics. They all found ways to be more than reminding you of the dream of the 90s and how gaming has changed drastically since then. These days, brawlers and skateboarding games are more or less niche genres, and JRPGs aren't quite the same force they used to be. Most importantly, all 3 of these games show that you can find new ways to breathe life into old properties and make them relevant again. And if these can set the standards as to what any revival should be like, then I'd be super happy with this. These 3 games being this good and setting the standard as to how to bring back these old properties should be the norm, not the exception.